thinking about the concept that sometimes we think more spending somehow leads to better help for families, and that certainly doesn't seem to be true without reforms to the programs that we have. I think about the fact that in New York City, their housing authority, one of America's largest housing authorities, we see that 1 in 5 public housing residents remain in its programs for more than 40 years. Does not sound like the road to the American dream to me. 20% of the residents, the New York City's housing authority programs, are there for 4 decades. That sounds like cycles and cycles of folks living in public housing. Can't be good for them, and certainly not good for anyone else. So I welcome a discussion on how we figure this out and moving forward. Think about the fact that when you think that money is the only solution to some of the challenges that we face, I think about the fact that during COVID, we spent billions of dollars on housing subsidies. And in addition to that, we typically spend billions of dollars regularly every year from the federal government. Despite this extra spending, or perhaps because of it, housing costs have certainly skyrocketed since 2020. You think about the fact the average sales price of a home has ballooned from $383,000 beginning in 2020 to $535,000 in 2022. Every rational economist would say a 40% increase in the cost of housing cannot be good for people buying houses. Instead of trying to cut back on the regulatory burdens or increase the supply of housing, this administration is dead set on inflating the demand. Examples of this abound, including FHFA's recent actions that will penalize borrowers who have done the right thing, saving for a down payment or increasing their credit scores. At the same time, cost continues to increase. The bureaucracy continues to increase. In just over a decade, HUD's budget has ballooned from $32 billion in FY 2014 to $73 billion in FY 2022. That's almost 130% increase with very little to show for it. This is a kind of a simple yes or no question I'd love the panel to answer. Does anyone oppose more accountability by our housing regulators administering these costly programs?
Just yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yes.
No.
No, we support more accountability.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm sorry. No.
Okay, good.
I needed to think about the question. Sorry about that.
Ranking
Member Scott.
I didn't have a follow-up for someone who says yes. So
No. I was thinking about
didn't know what to do next. This is good.
I was thinking about my 34 family members watching on C-SPAN right now.
I thought it was only 30, so just thank you for hanging out with us today. Inflation, yes, under the Biden administration. Okay, so the Road to Housing Act proposes incremental changes to making housing programs more accountable and grants housing providers needed flexibility to innovate, increase supply, and reduce costs to all families, but in particular, low-income families. How would you improve the legislation, Ms. Calder?
Well, thank you for asking. I appreciate what you've done to move housing policy forward with the Road to Housing Act, both on the innovation side, on the deregulatory side. As you know, there's so much that can be done to improve housing policy. I think one of the things that I would like to see or add sort of to the conversation as an objective for longer-term policy reforms is to continue to build on what the Road to Housing Act does and continue to move from supply side or production side housing subsidies towards tenant-based assistance. So, if we look at programs like, for instance, the low-income housing tax credit, this program tends to be representative of what sort of goes wrong when you support housing through the supply side. As I mentioned in my testimony, the benefits of the low-income housing tax credit primarily flow to developers, which is problematic when you have low income right in the title of the program, and it doesn't seem to be actually flowing to the people that it's intended to support. There's other issues with that program as well in terms of crowd out and other issues along those lines. So I think that's one of the things. And I think another thing that I would like to see longer term is just a move towards interim housing assistance. People sometimes have periods of financial distress, but they don't maybe need permanent housing support. They don't need long-term shelter. They just have a short-term problem and need sort of a way to get patched through during that difficult period.
One more question for you before I run out of time here. The Economic Innovation Group, the University of California, Berkeley, as well as the Treasury Department have shown that the Opportunity Zone investment has been heavily concentrated in our nation's poorest communities. One of the things that we're seeing, however, because of the investments in OZs in those areas, is a jump in about 20% of residential development without seeing the apartment rents in the same areas increase. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of homes in those areas without gentrification, which is a blessing from my perspective. Could you speak to the benefits of harmonizing tax policy and federal government programs so that they work together?
Sure can, and I did notice that EIG study that you mentioned. I think in order to see how important it is to harmonize federal tax policy and federal grant programs, we can look at an instance where it doesn't work, where it didn't work. The state and local tax deduction is one example of this from a housing policy perspective. The state and local tax deduction is capitalized into housing prices in expensive markets on the coast and wealthy, areas on the coast. At the same time, those are often the areas that have the highest levels of regulation. And what I've found in my research is that the areas with the highest levels of regulation also receive the highest per capita HUD subsidies. And so basically what you have are these policies that are sort of working against each other actively. On the one hand, boosting up the price of housing. On the other hand, you're trying to undo that with subsidies to reduce the cost of housing, and you sort of have a cat chasing its tail type of situation. And so I think that is representative of how important it is to get both the tax policy and the grant making right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Rhode Island's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.